will join us, and that should be okay. So, as moderator of today's wonderful, interesting event, I will say a few words about what I think is necessary to discuss in this event. First of all, I would like to mention that the world is changing and the world is moving towards something new, some different new model of the economy, of energy sector, of everything. So, and this movement towards deep decarbonization and climate neutrality of the world economy, has a lot of reasons. One of biggest reasons is the need to combat climate change. We all know that, but of course there are many other reasons. What exactly can be done and should be done and has been done so far regarding the rearrangement of the whole world economy, and specifically energy sector, industries, and many other sectors. European Union is one of leaders, probably the major leader in the world in this movement, in this change. And EU has done a lot already. And last year, specifically, the EU proposed some big changes, some new ambitious targets for EU and new instruments and mechanisms to reach these targets that will affect many others. And it will definitely affect Russia, as Russia is the major supplier of fossil fuels to the EU, and also supplier of metals, chemical fertilizers, and a lot of other products. I did my own calculations, and I found that at least 1 billion tons of CO2, this is the carbon footprint of all Russian export to Europe last year, when we had dramatic decline of export. So at least 1 billion tons of CO2 is embedded in Russian exports to EU. What if the EU will implement the plan of introducing carbon tax on import, and how that may affect that embedded carbon in our products? So to my mind, if the price, the rate of tax would be comparable to today's carbon price in European emission trading scheme, which is approximately 25, 27 euro a ton of CO2. So that would definitely be a huge, dramatic change in all export model for Russia. We should also remember that not only EU declared some ambitious targets of climate neutrality by 2050 or 2060, and these countries include other countries where we export a lot to, specifically Japan, Korea, China, US, Canada, Kazakhstan, and many others to come this year. So when we will discuss implications of EU Green Deal on Russian exports, on development of Russian economy, so we definitely should take into account the rest of the world or other countries that will definitely impose some carbon regulation. Maybe not prices, but some other carbon climate protective measures. I'm glad to introduce tonight, two speakers who will present their views, and then we will have quite a lot of time to discuss what they said and what you think about it. So first of all, Andrei Marku, Executive Director of European Roundtable on Climate Change and Sustainable Transition. And Igor Makarov, Head of Department of World Economy of Higher School of Economics. I'm glad we have more and more participants, already 167, and probably more will join us soon. I want to give the floor to Andrei Marku with his presentation. Please keep time limited for 15 minutes so we have time to discuss your presentation. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you, George. I appreciate very much. Pleasure. Too bad I'm not in Moscow, but that's life. Now, next slide, please. Well, look at CBAM. It is another one of these things that has become the kind of the fashion of the day. You have to remember that CBAM or BCA was never a favorite baby of the European Commission. It was quite clear they, it's not something that they pushed. It's something that I think in the end was a political commitment. So what I want to start by saying is that what I will see from here, the conclusion I will draft from what I hear, is that it's very simple, but it gets very complicated. However, I would make the statement at the beginning that any hope that this is something that's going to go away, I don't think it's going to happen, because there's a very deep political commitment in the EU for this to happen. So my sense is that it is going to be complicated, it's going to play in different ways, but there will be a proposal in June. So the first thing that you got to ask yourself is what do we need this BCA? Why do we do it? And the reason really why this is being done is very simple. Is we live in a Paris Agreement world, which is an asymmetric Paris Agreement regime. Different people doing different things. The EU, as you said, wants to be very ambitious and is really kind of run away ahead of the pack and wants to be the good student. And as a result of that, we ended up now with carbon neutrality in 2050 and 55% in 2030. These are very deep targets, very serious targets, and it's done on the back of half of them, or more than half of them, done on the back of the ETS and the emission trading system and carbon pricing. Now, what has happened is that in carbon pricing was the asymmetry resulting from the carbon price, which started at €5 went up to 30, and then went back to 5, but we're back to 35. And this asymmetry was put out of function, was addressed through free allocation, because there's two ways for allowances to come to the market. One is free allocation, one is through auctioning. The problem with the free allocation is that at some point, if the cap goes down, you're going to start running a free allocation. The free allocation, the split between free allocation and auctioning is set. And if you start going down, the cap goes increasingly low and fast. You end up in a situation where by 2030 at a 50% target, and this is 50% target, on a high demand scenario, you probably going to be 28% short of the free allocation that companies would expect to have. And if you do 55% by 2030 in a high demand scenario, you have a 35% deficit. Now these are very significant deficits. It is not minor deficits. So you got to do something else. And what people came up with is this border carbon adjustment. What is easier than tax the guys at the border and make sure that everybody pays the same level of price? Next slide, please. So the main idea behind the CBAM or the border carbon adjustment is that everybody pays the same amount for the same carbon embedded in the product, or is produced in the EU or outside the EU. That is the fundamental raison d'etre of a CBAM. In reality, there is a debate, and the debate is, why are we doing this? We're doing this to level the playing field, or we are doing this because it is a necessary condition for the EU to move from 40 to 55%, or are we actually doing this to kind of push other people to do what the EU does? And that is more controversial, at least in my estimation. As a think tank, that's more controversial, because that would run somewhat contrary to the Paris Agreement, where everybody does what they can. And that's the ethos of the Paris Agreement. So that's kind of where we are right now. That debate is emerging. Now, if you say more and more that it is about getting other people to do it, I think you may start running in trouble with WTO, because the the main explanation that you have to give the WTO to be compatible should be that you do this for environmental reasons and to level the playing field and for carbon leakage. The more you sway into other fields, the more difficult it's going to come. The process is ongoing. There was an EU inception impact assessment. There's a public consultation that finished. There's an impact assessment and a proposal as part of a package in June 2021, which is the package is called Fit for 55. The EU likes these slogans. Now it's Fit for 55%. So the whole package of ETS reform is Fit for 55. Next, please. Now the EU has in their inception impact assessment and also in the document for the public consultation, there are 4 ways that the EU is examining how to do this. A tax applied on imports at the border. That's kind of a simple one. This could be a border tax or a custom duty. The other one is an extension of the EU ETS, people having to buy allowances, importers having to buy allowances to neutralize the imports. That is what California is doing. The thing that you can do it 2 ways. You can do it version 2, option 2, or option 4. One of them you buy from under the cap of the ETS. The fourth option is that you don't buy from the cap, you buy from an infinite pool. So it's a virtual pool of allowances that you buy. And option 3 is a domestic VAT or excise type consumption level. So it's a consumption charge, something that is put on primary products, and that could be again like a VAT, carbon added tax that kind of adds as carbon increases and is transmitted and can be neutralized and paid at any level. And the advantages would be paid both to import. We apply both to imports and EU production, so there's no WTO issue here. There is certain elegance in this, but we can discuss a little bit more about this. Next, please. Now, I will not go through this. This all kind of gives you a list of things that we have done as part of our project. I think we're wasting the time, the precious time in my presentation. So let's go to the next slide. And now we've launched a project. We launched our first paper in which we unpacked a CBAM in a number of components. We'll discuss that. But we have the second part, and the second part is interesting because we are looking at a sectoral assessment. We will put together a BCA proposal. We'll analyze the CBAM proposal from the Commission, and then we'll look at a framework in terms of dealing with competitiveness and carbon leakage. So this tells you a bit of a mindset that we're also already beginning to think whether there's something typical for the various sectors, whether all sectors are the same and created equally and should be treated equally in the CBAM, or is different. Next, please. Now, so the goal of the sectoral assessment, what are we doing in this? I mean, I'm not telling you the project, I'm telling you the thinking. The thinking is that you talk to each sector. So we talk to the chemical sector and the aluminum sector and the cement sector and the electricity sector. And what we want to see is if there are characteristics in each sector or in different sectors that would militate for different type of CBAMs. It may be that different sectors require different type of CBAMs, and it may be that some sectors do not justify or do not lend themselves to the CBAM. Typically, is what you'll hear and what you probably hear is the guys that are very heavy in indirect emissions, indirect cost scope 2 emissions. These people say, I have no way to deal with scope 2 costs because it's cost versus emission, and I can't deal with that in the CBAM. So I really question whether I should be part of this. Next, please. So some of the questions that we're asking and trying to identify is the market structure and dynamics of the sectors, environmental considerations, foreign productions, emission intensity, the probability of resource shuffling. Resource shuffling is a big deal for many sectors in the EU. And that big deal comes from the concept that there is enough production in steel production in one area that could be used to export clean steel to the EU, while the rest of the production in the country is used to produce steel which is less than clean, and that steel then it's subsidizes the more expensive cheap steel. Trade patterns is another thing that we are concerned about. Next, please. So why are we doing this? If you look at the way we design and unpack a CBAM, is along a number of design elements. You know, coverage, trade flows, policy mechanisms, geographic scope. Each of these have different options. You can make options for the various elements of a CBAM. In terms of coverage of trade flows, do you do imports or imports and exports? In the policy mechanism, you had 4 examples of how you could possibly do it. The sectoral scope, do you do what do you cover all sectors? Do you cover only you know, upstream, you know, the basic material sector? You do go down the value chain. Emission scope, do you do scope 1, scope 2? So each of these you can make choices. You have options for each of the design elements. And the idea is to look at the various sectors, look at the characteristic of the various sectors, and if this characteristic will push you into choosing a import export on only the import only. It may be that for sectors in the EU, they're not big exporters. They don't export or is minimal, in which case maybe the export for that particular sector is not important. Some would argue that, for instance, cement is not a great exporter, so why are we so concerned? And I'm not militating for that, because I'll have a call from my cement friends very soon if I say that. But these are some of the things. So this is how we are thinking right now, is that it may be necessary to distinguish between the CBAM for the various sectors, or maybe not have some sectors in CBAM based on the characteristic of the system. And this is the ongoing work that we're doing right now. Next, please.
Здрасте. Мне нужна Лилия. Очень приятно, Вера.
I think somebody may be better if we silence. Okay, thank you. Now, some of the issues, the fact that it is not a silver bullet, I think we've said that before, and I will cover this very cursory, because what, you know, each of them can't make the you know, have been covered extensively in our paper. Now, trade flow coverage, this is an issue. Free allocation, what do you do with free allocation? Companies in Europe are used to free allocation to combat carbon leakage and competitiveness. The moment you take them off free allocation, they panic, because they give something in their hand for something they don't know. Plus, the sense is that the CBAM may not provide the same coverage as free allocation. Sectoral scope, you know, basic goods versus more downstream. How do you avoid resource shuffling? What do you do with the revenue? There's going to be a lot of money. What do you do with it? Do you use it for European companies? Do you give it in the form of subsidies to other countries to decarbonize? Do you use it for own resources, the commission? What do you do with the money? And how the money is going to be used is going to make a difference when it comes to compatibility with WTO. The last thing is crediting for foreign policy. If the Russian Federation doesn't have a price on carbon, doesn't have an ETS, how do I evaluate the level of effort in the Russian Federation? Or I just don't do it, and I don't give credit for foreign policy. I just charge everybody for 35 euros a ton. I don't care what's happening in the Russian Federation. Next thing. Yeah, so these are also some other high-level takeaways. You know, this needs to be put in context. There's a concern, the fact that we're putting all our eggs in the CBAM basket, you know, critical principle, central issue around the European Green Deal. The fact that ambition, raising the ambition and solving carbon leakage are intertwined. Frankly, you cannot decarbonize Europe by, I don't care, I raise my ambition, but I don't have a way to solve carbon leakage. The legal challenges around the WTO, how do you deal with this? Are you dealing with exemption on environmental exemption under Article 20? How are you going to do this? And in general, we don't think that this is a silver bullet. I think there's going to have to be a series of a series of measures to put in place to address this issue. Next, please. Now, in terms of quantitative assessment, because this is where we're going to finish now, I'm very conscious of the time, is we have tried to do, actually, some of your colleagues in I think it was in St. Petersburg, that gave us the inspiration, and we started looking at this and looking at what would be the cost of, the cost of a CBAM to various countries. And we are not doing a dynamic assessment. We don't do a model. We do not model. We do a static model based on a number of assumptions, including the fact that things don't change, that certain things stay static. So we put forward a number of assumptions that the most carbon intensive and important product will likely be affected, that the CBAM would initially cover import of a number of selected products, may be extended gradually. The fact that you will use a default value, whether it be a domestic or European or export of average intensity, and the fact that it has to be fully compliant to WTO. Next, please. Yeah, we are building 6 scenario, and again, there's very little time to go through this. The only thing that you have to take in place is the fact that you have 3 scenarios. You have EU price as a constant, and then you use EU intensity or non-EU intensity, or the delta between EU and non-EU intensity in calculating the impacts, price versus intensity of production. The second one, where you take the other one, that you take a delta in the CO2 price. So the delta is between what is happening, what you are paying as part of the EU ETS, and the price that is happening in the Russian Federation. And then you marry that with EU intensity, non-EU intensity, and delta of intensity. Now, the assumption that we're making is about 40 euros a ton for EU prices, and we're making the assumption of about 10 euros a ton for the Russian Federation in terms of the cost that is being used. It's an assumption that we make, and may be wrong, and you can contest it. It's just an assumption of what we made. Next, please. Yeah, so these are things that I think that we've said. Next, let's go to the next slide, because I think that one I said. So the result for the Russian Federation, if you take the scenario 1 against the EU prices, which about 40 euros a ton. So you look at scope 1 and scope 1 and 2. If you look, the amount will be about, a billion. I think that you jump one slide. Yeah. A billion two, between 920 and a billion two. That's kind of what we think in scenario 1, depending on the scope 1 and scope 2. That's when you marry EU prices with EU intensity. The second one, if you pay at EU prices, but the intensity that we calculated for the Russian Federation for the different sectors, then you have then you'd be again around a billion. In scenario 3, if you only pay for the difference in intensity at EU prices, you only pay it for the different intensity between Russia and the EU, the Russian Federation, the EU. The numbers are obviously much smaller, for the simple reason that and you could argue in this that people get free allocation in the EU, so really should only pay for the delta. What is above the EU intensity, you shouldn't be paying for the whole EU intensity. Then you go to slides 4 and scenarios 4 to 6. So if you want to go to next slide, please. So in this case, we're using a difference between a price of 40 in the EU and a price of 10 or a cost of 40 and a cost of 10 in the Russian Federation is about 30. And you do that in conjunction with U intensity. So the numbers go from 700 to 900. For the next one, you use Russian intensity and you go around 700, 800. And then the numbers are very low, but you have a difference in price, 30 multiplied by the difference in intensity. So it's about 60 billion or so. Obviously much lower number. So you can see that the design is going to make a big difference. And frankly, at this point, we are making assumption. We don't really know how this is going to be designed. Okay, we all speculate, we all read the tea leaves, but nobody really knows how it's done. Next, please. Yeah, so some of the key observation that use that the CBAM could have a highly diversified impact depending on the adopted design, sectoral, and emission scope. It's quite clear. You saw the number. There are many issues to be used. Use of EU or foreign default emission intensity. I think this is something that should be product specific and change over time to reflect technology change possible. There are problems for implementation related to data availability, especially in foreign countries. We are doing this in a number of countries, in Vietnam, in Thailand, and it's not easy to find the data. Is it possible, would it be possible for different, if you put it at EU intensity, will you allow individual exporters to challenge that and say your benchmark is X, actually I'm under that benchmark? Can you allow to do that? There are precedents in other products. And will you allow to credit for existing policy in non-EU countries? If they are carbon prices and it's quite a clear number, I think it's simple. If it's not a carbon price and you have a set of policies that you have to define what that translates in terms of cost per ton, then it becomes a lot more complicated. We have a discussion with people at the Electric Power Research Institute in Palo Alto, California. We have discussion with other people who tell us, for instance, that it's also unlikely that the US will have a federal carbon price. So how is the EU going to start evaluating what is the cost of carbon in the US, what's the cost of carbon in the EU, if you want to compare that to the cost of carbon in the EU. So these are a number of key observations that kind of give you pause and tell you that there's a lot of more complex than we initially thought. I think this is the last slide, I believe, and I'll stop here, George. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andrei. I would propose that we give the floor to Igor Makarov, and then two presentations combined would be discussed by all of our participants. Please, Igor, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Georgi. Do you see my screen now?
Yes.
Yes, great. So I will follow up the presentation of Andrei with a special focus on Russia and with some implications on Russia. So I will start with the slide which continues the probably major ideas of Andrei's presentation, that there are a lot of uncertainties still, and the concrete implications of CBAM to Russia will depend on the design of this measure, on the scope of CBAM, and there are many uncertainties in different issues. I won't repeat it because Andrei have already made an overview of all these uncertainties, but I will just say that they concern both sectors, the country, geographical scope of CBAM. It concerns also the form, the concrete design. It concerns emission scope. So in this slide, I'm showing the most probable probably way of determining all these elements, in my opinion. But again, I do not know how it is elaborated in the European Union, and many options are still available and many options are discussed. So we do not have any final information about how it will be implemented. But for sure, the CBAM will start probably with some sectors, not for all the sectors, and not for all the imports to the European Union for sure. It will start with probably with some pilot sectors, and the most obvious candidates for these pilot schemes are the most carbon leakage affected sectors, and these are iron and steel, non-ferrous metals, cements, probably electricity, as was mentioned by Andrei. And in all these sectors, Russia is one of the significant importers. In some sectors, like iron and steel, it's quite significant importer of these goods to the European Union. And Russia for sure will be one of the countries with which the CBAM will start, because Russia for sure corresponds to the major criteria which is mentioned in different political declarations and in different political documents now, that CBAM would be implemented to those countries, to all third countries which are not yet part of an effective carbon regulation scheme, or equivalent measures with similar goals and costs to those of the EU ETS. I should remind to some of our audience that Russia has no carbon regulation scheme yet in any form, and of course Russia is one of the major countries which corresponds this criteria directly. Of course, there are a lot of difficulties with implementation of CBAM. That's why I'm personally not sure that it will be launched in 2022 or even in 2023, because the difficulties are very numerous, and I can't imagine how they may be addressed at once very quickly. There are many debates in the European Union, within the European Union, whether it is necessary or not, because some people think, and some countries think, some business stations think that real carbon leakage is not a real problem, at least now, and that there are many opportunities to protect industries affected by regulation in the European Union, except for CBAM. And there are also debates about whether it is compatible to WTO or not, but I think that it is not the major problem actually, but because it is the issue of design, but not the issue of the implementation of CBAM itself. But however, it is a problem, and it will address continuous debate on these issues as well. The huge problem is what would be the reaction of other countries, not only Russia, but also and probably first of all the United States, because United States is also a country which corresponds to the criteria which was mentioned in these political declarations. But of course, the United States would not be happy to get the carbon border adjustment mechanism, and probably would respond. And so, of course, if these measures would be implemented to some Asian countries, including China, China would also probably respond. And there are some risks of continuous trade war, which is not zero and which should be considered, so of course, and is considered by policymakers in the European Union. Well, and we may also remember the previous attempt to expand the EU ETS to other sectors and to other countries, and to include the emissions which are generated by other countries into EU ETS, and it concerns that time international aviation. And actually that attempt failed. It was substituted further by the sectoral regulation promoted by ICAO, but still the attempt to include it to EU ETS failed, and it is a good illustration of how it is really difficult to include like such international issues to the regional regulatory scheme. It addresses a lot of different problems. Some of them were mentioned in this slide. In Russia, there are a lot of people who believe that it is protectionism, like pure protectionism, no environmental consideration, but it is just the attempt to defend, to protect European producers. But from the perspective of the EU, it is leveling the playing field, and it is fair if the European companies pay additional costs for because of environmental regulation, because of carbon regulation, which address the global problem, the common good. So the same or more or less the same costs should be bared by other companies, by the competitors of the European producers. So it is to the large extent all about competitiveness, and so everything which is about competitiveness, it is closely connected to protectionism. But however, it is very difficult and probably impossible to separate protectionist motives from environmental motives. But however, probably even this debate is senseless, because again, it is absolutely technically impossible to separate these two issues. One important question which was partly addressed, which was partly mentioned by Andrei, is what would be the criteria of how the European Union would define whether the country on which this CBAM is imposed correspond to this criteria of effective carbon pricing scheme, equivalent measures, equivalent costs, and so on, or not. And such questions, they concern the United States. The United States has no national-wide carbon price, but however, many states within the United States have their own carbon regulation schemes. So what to do with these measures? Or it also concerns China. China has a national-wide carbon regulation scheme, but the price is much lower than in the European Union. So probably the costs of carbon are not equivalent, are not similar at all to the European Union. So what to do with China? And it may also concern Russia, because Russia, of course, have no carbon regulation scheme. But however, Russia has huge energy taxes. And these energy taxes may be interpreted, I understand that it may be debated, but however, it may be interpreted as indirect carbon price. Right? Because energy production is taxed heavily in Russia. So it means that emissions which are generated within this with this production is also indirectly taxed. So can it be considered somehow within this decision on whether Russia corresponds to this criteria or not? It is a question. And this question is actually the central, in my opinion, in the debates whether these measures are protectionist measures or not protectionist measures. So does the European Union want that other countries would introduce the same regulation as in the European Union, or these regulations may be different somehow, they may be indirect, they may be somehow less ambitious, and so on. So this would be a very, very important question, and I have no answer on this yet. There are a lot of discussions in Russia, of course, about the potential effects of this measure on the Russian economy. There are some estimates already, some preliminary estimates. I know at least 3 different estimates of the effect of CBAM on Russian exports. They were made by KPMG, BCG, and the Institute of Economic Forecasting of the Russian Academy of Science. They are quite pessimistic. All the three are quite pessimistic. They are much more pessimistic than those estimates that were shown by Andrei in his presentation. You may see that the potential damage, the potential costs for the Russian exports from CBAM vary from 3 to about 5-6 billion euro or dollars per year. And it depends on different scenarios and depends on the institution which makes these estimates. But however, this is very, very significant. And it is from 2 to 4% of export revenues of Russian companies to the European Union. I think that Andrei's estimates are more correct. And these estimates that are shown in this slide are probably exaggerate the problem a little bit. First of all, because they include oil and gas industry as one of the industries which are potentially affected by CBAM. I think that it is unlikely that oil and gas industry may be included to this scheme in the near future. But if we take just metals, non-ferrous metals, cement, electricity, so the estimates would be more or less the same as Andrei shown, so about 1 billion euro per year, or even less, depending on the design which will be implemented. However, this is still a very significant damage, and it can't be just ignored. And moreover, CBAM, as was mentioned by Georgi in the very beginning, it is just a part of the story. And it is a part of the green transition in the global economy. And this green transition, it is not just limited by some actions of the European Union. It covers a lot of different countries, it covers a lot of different sectors and so on. And I have already mentioned that probably the response of other countries to the European CBAM would be the carbon-based custom duties from other countries, from the United States, from China, from Japan, from other countries. And so this agenda would be deeply implemented within the and deeply linked to trade agenda. So probably Russian exporters would face barriers not only on in the European market, but in the other markets as well. Moreover, there are many other different barriers which exist and already appear in front of Russian exporters, including the financial barriers from different international investors, from different global banks, and so on. And so I think that CBAM should be considered as only part of this story. And if we look at the whole story, we will see that Russia is very much vulnerable to this green transition of the global economy. You may see the comparison of the carbon intensity of Russian exports compared to other countries. Among all the largest economies of the world, Russia has the largest carbon intensity of exports. It means that Russian exports would be anyway vulnerable to this green transition. There are different potential responses. There is, of course, a very universal and very widespread in Russia response: doing nothing and waiting. So, for example, waiting of the time when the European Union would determine the concrete design of the CBAM, and then look at this design and then start to think how Russia may respond to this. I think that it is quite a little bit counterproductive, because anyway, Russia will face these barriers in many different countries, in many different sectors, and it is already obvious, in my opinion, and Russia probably should think about responses earlier than than the European Union would determine the concrete design of the measures it wants to introduce. Some people in Russia, and even some officials, some policymakers, they really believe that Russia may appeal these issues in the WTO. and it is impossible to implement these measures in a way which is compatible with the WTO. I think that it is a rational optimism, and to some extent the window dressing. So they believe that Russia may again wait and do nothing, and then the WTO will save us. I think it is impossible, just because for the European Union, it is absolutely obvious that this measure should be compatible with WTO rules, and there are many options how to do it, and Andrei listed some of them. And so one of these options would be chosen, and it would be compatible with the WTO. There are also debates in Russia whether Russia should introduce its own emission regulation system. Because if it introduces its own regulation system, it means that it will start efforts which are somehow comparable with the efforts which are introduced in the European Union. So it will mitigate the damage from the European carbon border adjustment mechanism. And so Russia will probably not eliminate the whole to the whole extent the damage, but it's at least mitigate it, decrease this damage. And so the Russian national carbon regulation scheme would be the response to the European Union, to CBAM. There are also some counter arguments against it. For example, the colleagues from the Institute of Economic Forecasting say that if this if this Russian national regulation scheme would be applied just to exported goods, it would probably be interpreted as an export duty, which are not compatible with the WTO rules. And if it is introduced to all the goods in affected industries, not only exported goods, but all the goods which are produced in Russia, it will probably be much more costly for Russian business than CBAM. And some Russian business also supports this. They believe that it is better to pay to the European Union this less than €1 billion per year than to suffer from the national regulation carbon scheme, which may be introduced in the Russian level. But at the same time, what is more costly for business, it does not mean that it is worse for the national economy. Yes, because one situation is when business pays to the European Union. The other situation is when business pays to the Russian budget, and this money may be used further to support the same business or other businesses or the different directions of the national economy, and we should understand it. At the same time, regulation may be introduced in carbon neutral ways, or in fiscally neutral ways. There are a lot of different options how to do it. So some taxes may be substituted by carbon taxes, and it is quite widespread practice in the global, which is supported by some international experience. So it does not mean automatically that carbon regulation in Russia is a huge additional load to the Russian business. It depends on how it is introduced. So if it substitutes some other taxes, it may be fiscally neutral. And finally, carbon emissions regulation in Russia is much more important for our country than just a response to CBAM. I have already mentioned that CBAM is just a part of the story, and all the debates about carbon regulation in Russia, they should not focus on CBAM itself. It should look at the much broader set of risks which stay in front of the Russian economy, Russian exporters, and so on, and they are much more numerous than just CBAM. Some of these risks are shown here. It is a slide from our recent work together with the colleagues of MIT, which shows the risks for Russian exports of fossil fuels in different scenarios of green transition globally. And so we've shown that even if all the countries just fulfill what they declared in Paris, the exports of Russian fossil fuels would decrease significantly by 2030, and if the ambitions would be much more, much larger after 2030. So there may be the absolute decline of Russian exports of fossil fuels after 2030. Given that countries become more and more ambitious in these years, so the last scenario, 2 degrees scenario, is closer and closer. So it is quite a polar scenario, but the reality would be not very far from it, probably. So the carbon regulation in Russia probably should be considered in the context of all these risks, not just CBAM. I have already, I'm already behind my time for my presentation, so I will stop here, and probably in the further discussion I will discuss some other issues concerning the CBAM and Russia-EU cooperation, in potential cooperation even, not only contradictions concerning the green development. Thank you.
Thank you, Igor. Thank you. And special thanks that you presented the picture in much broader sense. So now we faced a lot of issues within these presentations, and probably a lot more besides, so that we have to cover a lot of interesting aspects of that topic. So how we can do it? I would propose the following. We will take a few comments, remarks, questions, and then give some time to our presenters to respond to some comments and questions, including those presented in our chat. So please, Igor and Andrei, check the chat. And then I have some first requests from Oleg Pluzhnikov. I'm not quite sure if he's still with us, because he had to go to some meeting, but it's important to listen to him, as he is also former representative of European Roundtable on Climate Change and Sustainable Transition. So if Oleg is around, please give your comments. If not, probably not. Then second advance request was from Mikhail Yulkin. So please, several minutes, not more. Mikhail, the floor is yours. Unmute, please. Mikhail, unmute.
Sorry, I didn't.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you very much for the two of the presentations. It was quite an extensive, I would say, introduction into the matter, with lots of ideas to think further over, both from Andrei and from Igor. Thank you very much, guys. Now, my few comments would be probably like this. I would probably start with saying that, okay, Russia is probably one of the few countries among the developed ones that do not still have carbon regulation in place, that actually make the situation quite difficult for us to negotiate with Europeans and to put forward our own kind of climate agenda, because we don't have one. Well, referring to the energy taxes potentially, that we can potentially be interpreted as if they are carbon tax, I wouldn't say that it is very, very productive. It's like window dressing, not more than that. So basically, we are creating this kind of crisis ourselves. And this would probably mean that we would need to reapproach our strategic vision of the future, and reapproach our vision of how the Russian economy should develop further, especially with the view of what the Russian president says quite recently, probably today, when he was making his presentation to the World Economic Forum. I doubt that it's all good, but still. Now, another topic to discuss would be, okay, we were kind of misconception, because I think that once the carbon price would be introduced to the new industrial sectors in the EU, that would actually lead to the immediate rise in the commodity prices. And then the competition would be on a kind of higher level of prices rather than we have today. That actually means that, well, this is not that bad. It will probably be kind of compensated a little bit in terms of the rising, the general rise of the market prices in the commodity markets, which also nice. And then another probably thing we should keep in mind is the attitude of the investment community, so to say, right? So they are kind of tightening their criteria for the companies in which assets they're going to invest further. And if we're laying behind the market and laying behind the general trend, then again, we are kind of risking the further investments in the Russian economy. So like summarizing, I would say, okay, carbon border adjustment mechanism is like a teaser for Russian economy, like a teaser for Russian businesses, something that makes them wake up to the problem and start discussing it in a more, I would say, like practical way rather than theoretically concept of whatever climate change mitigation. And that is good. But at the same time, we should really focus on a broader concept of climate change mitigation and the role Russia can play in this. And again, I would also like to say again, thank you very much to Igor, who put it in a broader concept of changing the world economy towards low carbon development route, which actually would mean that we would risk basically the Russian exports, first of all, in hydrocarbons, and we need to do something about that. And probably the sooner we introduce carbon regulation, the sooner we start creating real signals to the market players within Russia that carbon intensity is something we should really care about, the sooner, the better would be for the benefit of the Russian economy at large. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mikhail. Thank you. Please, Igor and Andrei, remember the comments, the questions. So when you will have a chance to talk, then you would respond. Now the floor is to Igor Bashmakov. Please, Igor.
Thank you, George. I have few comments and questions comparing to presentations we just have heard. First, I didn't quite well understood from Andrei's presentation whether we will be able to report on company level carbon footprint, and that's quite important for businesses because businesses will try to reduce carbon footprint, and that means that to have incentives for them, it should be reported on the company level. And that again, another question, what is the company level or installation level or number of installations levels which combines the whole processes? What are the boundaries of the system? So that is quite important practical question for businesses. A second item to discuss, many estimates which were presented are made based on input-output tables models, which are quite weak in presenting products and technologies. So because of that, we need another instrument set which will allow us to better estimate potential losses. And this instrument should incorporate technologies and products rather than input-output table, which definitely overestimate losses because products are expressed in volumes for ferrous metallurgy, for example, or for non-ferrous metallurgy, but in practical implementation, there would be just separate products, not all products which are produced by this industry and are assessed in monetary terms in input-output tables. Another issue is the whole system is designed to penalize those who provide to the international market basic raw materials. And those are not just China, India, and Russia, but many developing countries located in Africa, Latin America, and elsewhere in Asia. So that mechanism will penalize substantially those who produce bulk raw materials, and there would be no taxes to those who produce complicated, complex products for which carbon footprint is very difficult to evaluate. And so that will probably raise substantial negative response from developing countries. And I just want to understand how this problem is going to be handled. Data collection becomes a very important issue for Russian businesses. They are just beginning process for Russian businesses to calculate their carbon footprint and right methodology, which is corresponds very much to those which are going to be used by European Union, have to be developed and applied for Russian businesses to be able to report and to check whether their carbon intensities are higher, equal, or lower than those in the European Union. And then verification problem comes to this screen, and the question is how this verification is going to be handled. And finally, we can have a sort of, from other countries, negative sort of this tax war. It could be expressed in things like, for green technologies, the localization level will be raised, and that will reduce potential acquisition of those products from other countries, and will force them to go to invest in countries which will pay carbon taxes. So how this negative, not negative, but issues which countries can respond with different tools to compensate, not probably fully, but partly, this introduction of carbon tax, border adjustment carbon tax. Thank you.
Thank you, Igor. I saw that Anastasia Pasova wanted to ask a question, but I'm not quite sure if you still.
Yeah, there was
Yes.
actually a question,
Yeah.
but I typed it in the chat as well, but I can actually announce it.
Okay.
I had actually two questions. Thank you very much for your presentations. The first one is rather for Andrei. The second one is rather for Igor. I'm quite worried, and I think everybody is, about the problem of carbon dumping and how can it be solved. It's common knowledge that this problem will inevitably arise when establishing a common system of carbon tax. And another part of this problem is like the contradiction with the principle of common but differentiated policy of United Nations, and how the carbon tax is going to overcome it, or to deal with it, or to go along with it. I don't know. If you could answer this question, please, I would really appreciate the answer. And the second question is more about Russian answer and Russian strategy. So my question is as follows. At the moment, there are many corporations, as we know, that, like, for example, Fosagra and Severstar, that have given their own responses on the corporation level to the strategy. But there is no, as Igor has mentioned, a national strategy and national concept. As well, there is no unique Russian institution that could answer this climate change questions. So do you think the proposed measures that are quite popular now, like green certification or green obligations, like RZD practices nowadays, the Russian railroads, are they really effective and efficient? Or should we think of something new, and should some common institution be installed in the nearest future? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anastasia. Please, Igor, Andrei, we have gathered lots of questions. Please, your reaction. I don't know. But
Doesn't mean that we gather a lot of answers, Georgi. I mean, what Napoleon said, there's no stupid question, there are only stupid answers. So anyway, look, Igor was kind of things that Igor raised. It's let me make this clear again. I mean, we are reading tea leaves right now. We look at the only official documents that exist is the public consultation document and the impact inception impact assessment document. These are the only official documents that there are, and you try to read into them what you can. We also have statements that come from senior people in the commission, so you try to get a sense of that. It is clearly an issue whether this is at what level what level you apply this to, how you deal with the company, the installation, nation. It was a lot of my colleagues would argue that this is going to be done by company, for argument's sake. So if you're an exporter and you have a benchmark in the EU, you should have in WTO the right to prove that you are meeting that standard. And that is, I think that is happening in other products, in the forest product, in many other products where there are standards with especially the EU, because the EU is putting a lot of environmental standards. One could make also the argument, on the other hand, that this is very fundamental. This is not about coffee or about wood. This is about the energy matrix of a country. And this is not about the energy matrix of the country. This is the way the world is run. Let's be quite blunt about it. This affects everything, whether I can fly for my weekend to Italy or not, and whether I drive or I don't drive, and whether I take the subway or I walk. I mean, this is very fundamental. So do you want to give a foreign government the ability to influence your own companies? I don't know. I mean, that is something that I'm sure that there are people in the Russian Federation that think about that. I mean, I'm a think tank. I think and I raise issues. On the other hand, it is not a system that has not been applied again. It is almost an expectation that this would be allowed. And I think in WTO, the way I understand it, that you have to provide that opportunity. So that is one thing that I would argue. In terms of, yes, I agree with Igor. I mean, this is a input-output tables. They are very simplistic. There's no doubt about that. They are very simplistic. The numbers that we have do not take the oil and gas in the export of the Russian Federation into account. The numbers would get off the charts if that is the case. We're taking steel, cement, aluminum, electricity. Electricity, somebody asked us, I think we're looking at the number that I saw in the electricity export, about 12 terawatt hours. It's probably, you're right, it's probably somewhere around Finland and maybe some of the Baltics. The other places where you have electricity problems in EU would be around Spain from Morocco, in the Balkans from Turkey, that's, Serbia, Turkey, this kind of stuff that you'd have. I'm not, the CBDR question, look, this is what I raised at the very beginning. The question really is, why are you doing this? Because under WTO, you should be doing this to to prevent an environmental problem. That's what you're doing. Now, if you're doing it to incentivize other people, so carbon leakage is a legitimate concern. If you're doing it, at least I would raise the question, if you do it to incentivize, let's put a polite word, to incentivize the Russian Federation to do something, it's not doing anything. By the way, it's not the only country. The United States is also not doing anything right now. And I don't know that we would have this discussion if the American election had gone another way. Probably we may not have had the discussion so acidly. But if that is the case, how do you deal with the situation? If that, if you don't have, and this thing also comes back is to how do you calculate, what do you take into account? The simpler answer is you take into account a visible carbon price. If you take into account, if you start trying to account for different policy that could be construed as being climate change policies, it's become very subjective. And I don't know that there is anybody that has the ability, and maybe the EU bureaucracy may have the ability to evaluate all the policies of the Russian Federation, all the policies of the People's Republic of China, India, Brazil, South Africa, and others. but I don't think there's that many countries that have the ability to do that. And how do you do it? And nobody's done it yet. I mean, there has been a few attempts that I know of to evaluate what is the equivalent price put on different efforts, and they always fail. So I think this is not an easy thing to do. In terms of the issue, what is being exported, yes, I mean, this is conceived as being something that is applied to primary materials, more or less. If you start getting into an iPhone, I mean, a bicycle, and I don't know what, then it becomes very difficult. And we're looking at a situation where we're looking at aluminum that is imported from Singapore into Thailand, and then they export it to the EU. I mean, how am I going to find out? How am I going to find out the primary aluminum? I don't even know where it comes from. So how am I going to do that? These are real problems. This is why I said it's very attractive. It's a very attractive approach. When you start actually starting to implement, it becomes a little bit of a can of worms. In terms of the CBDR, because that is something that we started. If your intention is to push others to do the same thing that you do, because if that is the case, then we're all on the same playing field. There's no asymmetry, and then I don't need a CBAM. Then one could argue that this is not in line with not necessarily the CBDR, but because the CBDR comes from the UNFCCC, from the Framework Convention from Rio '92. But this is the Paris Agreement. Now we're dealing with the Paris Agreement. CBDR is being slightly reinterpreted in the Paris Agreement in different ways, common but differentiated responsibility. But nevertheless, the fundamental building block of the Paris Agreement is an NDC. Now, would anybody argue that this is not right? I mean, yes, you could argue it, but the question is, who are you arguing with? History is written by the victors in the end. That's So if you're dealing with the European Union alone, I think you may have an argument. When the moment you start dealing with the European Union and the United States and potentially China, if they all accept this, then I think it's very difficult to get into argument. Is the United States, how are they going to react? President Biden, it seems to be also going that way. But there are a lot of people in the new administration, the climate change, that are not favorable to this. But a very fundamental constituency of the Democratic administration, the trade unions, are also very concerned about what is happening. So my sense is that you're going to have to follow very, very closely what is happening in the other major trading parties around the world to figure out whether this is something that is another ICAO, or the world has changed. Because yes, there was a flop in ICAO, but this is not, what was it, 2012, whatever year it was, when ICAO, when the first ETS, aviation in ETS was. But the world has changed, and the Paris Agreement is changed, and the 2 degrees is changed, and the world is changed. So what may have flopped in 2012, 2014, I don't remember what year it was, may not flop now anymore. I'm sorry, Georgi, I may have been.
Thank you, Andrei. Yes, I want to give the floor to Igor Makarov with his comments and responses to the questions, please.
Apologies.
Yes, thank you, Georgi. Actually, there were a lot of different questions and comments, but I will try to respond to some of them. Sorry if I'm not able to catch everything. First, what Igor Bashmakov said about input-output tables, I fully agree with it. And any analysis based on input-output tables exaggerates the real damage. And it is not only technologies, because of technologies, it is also because any analysis based on input-output tables does not take into account the opportunities to reorient the flows of goods to other markets, like to China, for example. It is technically possible to do it, but as far as I understand from those estimates that were made by Russian colleagues, it was not done, and it may mitigate some of the risks. That's why of course, in additionally to those estimates that we already done, other estimates are needed to understand the real damage for the Russian economy from CBAM. Input-output tables are really limited instrument. I agree with Mikhail Yulkin that it is very trivial and silly and simplistic to say that yes, here we tax our energy. That's why we it is already carbon price. So take into account this carbon price in your estimations. I meant a little bit different thing, that many measures that may be taken in Russia in the area of decarbonization, they may be taken in the energy area and with the energy tax. And these measures should not include directly carbon tax or carbon or cap and trade, for example. There are a lot of opportunities to introduce the elements of carbon price to Russian energy fiscal system, and there are a lot of opportunities to incentivize energy efficiency through the taxation and energy system. And probably these ways to launch decarbonization for Russia are more politically feasible than just introduction of carbon tax or ETS, not ETS, but emission trading system, yes, in Russia. That's why it is important to understand whether these potential measures may be taken into account by the EU within CBAM. But of course, there can be no discussion about whether the existing taxes may be considered as just carbon price. But however, for Russia, this question is very interesting, because Russia is a country where energy taxation is very, very important. It is much more important than in the European Union. So it amounts to 40% of budget revenues. And so there are a lot of opportunities to do something within this energy system, but not additional to it. And so, yes, it is important to understand whether it may be taken into account. There was a question from Irina Kustova in chat about the greenhouse gas regulation scheme in Russia. What is the fortune of this regulation scheme? Now the law wasn't finally adopted, but I think that it would be adopted in the near future. But this law does not suggest any regulation of greenhouse gases in terms of carbon pricing, in terms of carbon taxes or emission trading system. It just includes some preliminary issues like monitoring, like verification, which are necessary but not sufficient to introduce a full-scale carbon regulation scheme. That's why it is called the law about regulation of greenhouse gases, but actually it is not about regulation itself, but only about its very small part. Again, necessary but insufficient. There were some comments in chat about the potential cooperation between Russia and the European Union. And so there was a comment of Olga Kaspar who proposed the idea that money that may be collected from CBAM from Russia may be then directed to the Russian low carbon projects. It sounds good, but I think it is politically unfeasible, and it is. I think that it would be much more. Which will make much more sense to introduce some forms of carbon offsets within the European trading system. But even this faces a lot of difficulties, and most of the European policymakers do not believe in offsets and do not want to introduce them. But this scheme, which is proposed by you, is even more ambitious in this area, and I think that it is politically unfeasible. However, I believe that there are a lot of opportunities of cooperation between the EU and Russia in the area of decarbonization, and these opportunities are related to the simple fact that it is very likely to that it is much cheaper to reduce emissions in Russia than to reduce emissions in the EU, just because of the much lower basic level of carbon efficiency in Russia, and because of a lot of low carbon projects which were not used because of the lack of incentives. So it is cheaper to reduce emissions in Russia than in Europe, and it means that yes, some linking of regulatory schemes in Russia and in the European Union would be beneficial, both from the perspective of coping with climate change. So the emissions should be reduced there, where in those countries and in those regions where they are the cheapest. And it is quite senseless to concentrate all the efforts in the achievements of zero carbon emissions in the area which amounts for 9% of global emissions in the European Union, which takes just 9% of global emissions. It is for what we should concentrate on a reduction of all these emissions, this 9%, and not doing the same in all other world. So of course it is cheaper to reorient of some of flows of climate finance to other regions, including Russia. But to do it, Russia should do itself something at least. Yeah, Russia should introduce the infrastructure of carbon markets in Russia. Russia should initiate and should propose to link it with the European carbon markets, with the opportunities for offsets from the European Union to Russia, and so on. Again, for the European companies, it would be cheaper to reduce emissions in Russia than in the EU. Yes, there are also political obstacles, of course, but all this may be solved. But there should be some initial steps from the Russian side, I think. Yes.
Thank you, Igor. Thank you. I saw that Vasily Andreev, Interrao, wanted to raise a question. I'm not sure if you still have that question. If so,
yes, thank you very much. Thank you. So I would like to thank, obviously, Igor and Andrei for the fantastic presentation. I have a brief question. Obviously, Interrao, we are a large generation diversified holding company which exports to the EU. Now, my quick question for, I guess, Andrei is that how crucial is it for a company to verify its emissions? I mean, on a national level, if we look at the two different protocols, yeah, for greenhouse gases, there are small differences between GHG protocol and the Russian national protocol for measuring these greenhouse gases. So I would like to ask you, would this require verification from a government level to confirm that the level of carbon offsets is verified from Russia, and how will this process happen as well? Because there are slight changes between the methodologies. So we're concerned. I mean, we have already verified. We're just wondering if you could say something on the importance. Will there be a universal protocol used to measure the exact carbon offsets or not?
thank you. And also we have very good questions in the chat. And one specifically of interest to me is of Sergei Kondratiev about impact of CBAM on Russian oil and gas sector, energy export, etc. And very good comments on this question from Igor Bashmakov. So I guess that would be very interesting, personally for me. So a lot of fossil fuels are exported to EU today from Russia. So what would happen to this export? Please go ahead, Andrei, Igor.
Look, to fuels, export of primary energy fuels has not been at this point included in the discussion. It has not emerged anywhere in the discussion. Oil and gas has not appeared in the discussion so far. it doesn't mean that it's not somewhere possibly on the list. I mean, if you take the California example, there is a kind of a CBAM, it's only done not internationally, done on interstate commerce clause law. They do force importers of energy to purchase allowances from the California ETS. So that is on the basis of adjusting the cap based on forecast of number of allowances, but it hasn't taken place in the EU. We have in our calculation, we haven't included. I've seen some of the other calculations. I think that Igor is referred to, which obviously it's a factor of 20 or so, or 50 times maybe increase in the cost to the Russian economy. I would argue that the CBAM in principle is to avoid carbon leakage, and I don't see the justification. I mean, I think it will be difficult to justify applying this to exports because there is no carbon. There would be no carbon leakage in this case. I just don't see it. Maybe it's there. In terms of the question from Vasily Andreev, you're asking me a question that is, some would say that, the first polite thing to do is say it's a very good question. But the second answer is really that it is a premature question. I think we're nowhere near to that level of detail. The only example that I would take it's obviously going to be a sensitive thing. And the only example that I can think of is under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, in the various offset programs, there are agreed protocol. And if you look at the Japanese doing some of their carbon reduction projects under the JCM, they do agree to protocols with the partner countries. If you look at the Swiss doing an agreement with Peru, they do agree on it's a bilateral agreement on protocol. So there will have to be some kind of agreement. Whether there will start being a full auditing by the European Union of what is happening in China, Russia, and Brazil, I think that we're going to get into kind of a ghost plan type of situation here pretty soon if we do that. And I think that we're living in the carbon market into market economy, and there is going to be, yes, we're living in a society now that a lot of the things that were not possible in terms of planning 30 years ago were just the dream of some bureaucrat. Today, they're much easier to implement to the simple way of how the IT industry has evolved. So is it possible? Is it possible? Is it going to become incredibly complicated to tag every piece from the origin and keep a track on where happened to every gram of steel or every gram of iron ore or bauxite? I think that will probably be a little bit over the top, and people will skirt from that.
Thank you, Andrei. Igor Makarov, yes, please.
Thanks. Actually, I agree with Andrei that CBAM is not about oil and gas itself, and it is unlikely that oil and gas would be part of this mechanism. But what may be done and what should be done is to estimate the effect of European Green Deal and the European plans of decarbonization on the Russian exports of oil and gas, which, in my opinion, it is much more serious issues for the Russian economy than just CBAM, because CBAM is it is the most urgent because it stays right now. But in terms of the losses to the Russian economy, the European Green Deal itself and the very ambitious targets of decarbonization for first to 2030s and to 2050 would affect the Russian economy much more, and especially the energy exporters. And I will demonstrate the slide for a second. Here is the slide which shows the potential effects of the European Green Deal on the Russian exports of fossil fuels. And it is exactly what the question is about. So here are our estimates in first for the Russian coal in the leftward part, and then to Russian gas. For the Russian coal, the targets which were declared by the European Union are already very, very dangerous. For gas, the trajectory to decrease, which is corresponding to zero, to net zero targets of the European Union by 2050, also means the decrease of exports of Russian gas starting from 2030. So actually, these calculations should be updated actually, because INDC scenario comes from the assumption that the European Union would decrease emissions by 40% by 2030, but now the target is minus 55%. So this picture is more optimistic for Russia than what goes from the new targets, the updated targets. So it should be updated. But the general level of the costs and of Russian exports is presented here. And I agree that it is a very important issue that should be taken into account by Russian policymakers. The Russian
Thank you, Igor Bashmakov. I think you have some comments.
If I can just add one thing, Georgi, if I can, just one thing. I mean, you referred, I mean, but a lot of people, I mean, what needs to be also understood is that you refer from 40 to 55%, but the reality, the industrial sector is under ETS, and ETS is actually going to have to be 63%. So this is 63% by 2030. That is, you know, people are beginning to wake up to the reality. In Europe, there are no allowances. Sorry, I just wanted to bring this reality in, Georgi. Apologies.
Thank you, Andrei. So it makes life even, you know, funnier. Yeah, in some sense. Igor Bashmakov, you have raised your hand. Do you have some comments, please?
One comment and issue to be raised is how we can handle Article 6 mechanisms of Paris Agreement incorporated in this, whether countries and companies which will implement some projects and will have this emission reduction could somehow use those within this CBAM mechanism. That my question, and my comment is that what just Igor Makarov said, in terms of whether we can have substantial economic growth based on existing development model. Many models and Russian long-term strategy, low carbon strategy, assumes that Russia somehow can have 2 to 3% GDP growth per year, but as Igor just have shown, and many other studies, including studies we do, show that it's really difficult to achieve, because oil and gas sector in the best conditions, in the best circumstances, will only be capable to provide stagnation of the Russian economy. So we need new drivers, and those drivers are mostly low carbon technologies. And the question is, in terms of economic development, and not only just health of separate companies, is to how we can use some opportunities of low carbon transition to identify new drivers for economic growth.
Well, thank you, Igor. Andrei, Igor,
I'm always, Georgi, I'm always interested. I mean, we had discussions with South Africans and with a whole bunch of other people around the world, and people always raise, they see CBAM connected to, under UNFCCC, they see it connected to Article 6 somehow. I'm struggling to connect it. I think that probably would be connected to Article 6.8 somehow. And because it doesn't have much of a scope right now, I think people are struggling to come up with something, and we've been desperately trying to figure out what we do with Article 6.8 for the last 3 years. So international cooperation in the area of border adjustment of some sort may be something that could come under Article 6.8 is possible. There is but clearly a CBAM fits under another section under Article 15, I think it's of the 415 of the Paris Agreement, which is response measures. That it's a classic response measure. There is no more classic than this one. So whether this is going to be something that will need to be addressed, because how do you do this? You do this basically diversify. There is no other way. I mean, it is somebody, you said, I think at the beginning, or Igor, Makarov, it's simply a different world. The concepts just don't match anymore. So the growth and the fact that we can tinker here and tinker there, it just doesn't work. Because as I said to you, in 2030, 2040, European companies are waking up to the fact that there are no allowances. It's not that they're going to be here, or I'm going to buy it from there, or I'm going to do this. They're just none. So if you think that you're going to be able, if you accept this model of development, if you think you're going to grow up, continue to grow based on industry that requires some kind, the only thing that you can do is you can find out of capturing these things through a CCS, CCU type of protocol to create what our Saudi friends will call a circular carbon economy. Then you go into that kind of concept, and yeah, this is a concept that's been put up. It's been on the G20 table a few months ago, and something for a major energy exporter of hydrocarbons is probably something that you're going to have to look at.
Thank you. Igor, you have some responses?
Yes, thank you. Actually, I have no response to what Igor Bashmakov said, because I fully agree with him. But I think that we have a number of questions in chat, and probably we should respond to them somehow. And I would probably ask you to also to look at them and to ask to us, because I may skip something. I see the question from Maxim Titov. If we are lucky enough to get carbon emissions regulation in place, what would be the mechanism of using funds collected from companies? I think that it is an important question, but not the most important concerning the greenhouse gas regulation in Russia, because any regulation which creates some price for carbon, it may be negative price for carbon emissions, or it may be positive price for reduction of carbon emissions. It creates incentives for companies, and it is the most important in regulation. So of course, if the carbon price, like carbon tax, for example, is accumulated to the special green fund from which the green projects are further financed, so it would be stronger incentive, and it would be stronger regulation which would push Russia forward towards the green development. But actually, even the carbon tax or emission trading system which creates the carbon price, it already creates some incentives for companies, and it already is important. Even if this money are collected to the federal budget or to regional budgets and then may be spent to different areas, even that would be much better than no regulation. So there are a lot of issues concerning the design of carbon price in Russia, of potential carbon price in Russia, of potential regulation in Russia. I have already said that, in my opinion, for Russia, more politically feasible and more economically beneficial would be the reforms of energy fiscal systems and introduction of carbon price additionally to the existing energy fiscal system. But all these are details, and I think, of course, they should be discussed as well. But the most important issue is that we should have carbon regulation. We should have the system of incentives for companies to reduce emissions. It is the most important, in my opinion.
Thank you, Igor. We have lots of interesting comments from Dmitry Ryzhkov. I'm not sure if Dmitry is present. Probably yes. If you want to ask some specific question, please go ahead.
Well, thank you very much. There are just comments, not actually questions. And these are my take on some of the senior technical issues with regards to CBAM. To summarize very quickly, I think if we put aside the introduction and aside the political issues, macroeconomic indicators, and I do apologize for doing that. I have very procure company.
Dmitry, sorry, we don't hear you well. Unfortunately. Okay, so can I ask Igor Makarov to respond to the comments of Dmitry as he wrote them? But I also have some specific question about the price. So what would be the rate? What would be actually be the price of carbon in Europe? And maybe Andrei may respond to it. What are projections? What are expectations? Today we have approximately 25, 27, 30 euro a ton of CO2, but I believe it will rise and probably rise quite quickly. So what are expectations, say, within 5 years, 10 years?
I saw study with the price of $590 per ton of carbon by 2050, and I was shocked by that.
Wow. Okay, Andrei, maybe you have some ideas about the prices.
Well, look, I mean, we
just to frighten us.
No. I mean, frightening. You know, I used to work in a trading company in Geneva, and we used to say that if the price, you know, in those days, if I went away for 6 months and the price was 5 or 50, I wouldn't be surprised, because this is very much driven by sentiment and regulatory belief. So in principle, you cannot do what you do at a price or the prices that are being forecast, which are around 40, 50. That is not something that can be done. You need higher prices. The problem is that you're not going to get prices in 80, 20s or 80, 100 euros a ton, because the industry won't be able to survive in Europe. It's just, so what will happen, I don't think the prices are going to fluctuate that high for two reasons. One of them, either you have a CBAM, which is going to shield, and that's the prices are not going to go there. The second one, you're going to have subsidies. There's not that many ways to deal with this in order to get industry over an investment hump, because there's an investment hump now that happens in 23, 24, 25, and that is good, supposed to be good for the next 10, 15 years, but nobody's going to invest in this because the technology that you invest in here by 2030 is going to be out of date. So somebody's going to have to guarantee you that you can make an investment that will take you for the next 6, 7 years when you can make the next investment. So the only way to do this is really probably subsidies. The same way the power industry is decarbonized based on feed-in tariffs, probably the same thing is going to have to do this, because Europe has had a plan how to decarbonize electricity, but Europe doesn't really have a plan how to decarbonize industry. And you know, some of us still want to have an industrial Europe. So I would bet that the price is going to, you know, at some point, short of the Russian Federation, the United States, China having prices, very high prices, the price is going to linger around 40, 50 euros a ton. I don't think it's going to go any higher than that. It's already very painful. For the aluminum industry, it is north of 15% of the bottom line. That's a lot of money.
Okay, thank you. Igor Makarov.
Yes, I know the study of the European Commission, which was like the official calculation of the impacts of this target 55% for 2030. The price there is projected at the level of 50 euro per ton of CO2 emissions. So I think that it is more or less adequate estimate. But I should say that the level of price is it depends on the dynamics of economic activity. So now the crisis happens, and it means that emissions fall down, and it means that the price also falls down. So emissions are reduced for the lower costs if we take into account, if we equalize costs to the carbon price. So it should be taken into account that all these estimates, they come from the like more or less normal development of the economy. If the economy would develop slower than in the baseline level, it means that the emissions would reduce without high prices. But if the economic growth is fast, it means that the prices would be also higher. So that's why all these estimates for now, for 2030, they are very, very like simplistic and preliminary.
Georgi,
Yes.
I think we're heading towards kind of beginning to wrap up in some way. So I'd like to, a couple of things that I wanted to say. One of them was this question of offsets and so on. Somebody asked that question. We had the question from a couple of G77 countries, I would call them. And the fact of the matter is that if you offset your emissions by buying, local offsets, which are much cheaper, it kind of defeats the purpose of the CBAM, because you're to comply with cheaper offsets from whatever country you're in. So I think that is a great idea, but I don't think it's going to fly. The reality in the end, the bottom line of all this, if you believe that this is going to hold because it's a new world, this is it's different. Everything is different. In case we haven't seen, I haven't been out of the house for I don't know for how long. So it's a new world. And in this case, it is not about, because somebody said something about the Russian NDC, and you're going to make the Russian NDC great. But please understand, it's not about the Russian NDC, it's the relativity of the effort. And if the effort that you make, you may be the Russian NDC, or any NDC at some point when you start talking about CBAM, stop meaning anything, because you start comparing the level of effort, the level of carbon intensity. So that, meeting your NDC is just not going to be enough, because I think the NDC may be, not in so many words, in polite conversation, be deemed inadequate. The second, so what's your option? Your option is either to pay to the EU or to pay to the government of the Russian Federation. Which one is it? I think it's a no-brainer.
Thank you, Andrei. I will take two more comments, and then we will wrap up. So please, Mikhail Yulkin and then Igor Bashmakov. Couple of minutes, please.
Yes, thank you very much. Again, a little bit in terms of pricing. Well, first of all, there's more high ambition in terms of target setting for EU means actually the rise of price. And I had like a chance to see an estimate that the price will go as high as 75 euro per ton by the end of the decade, which is something we should bear in mind. Then if you look into the new technologies arising, for instance, in the steel making, these hydrogen technologies, they also kind of envisage the high price for carbon. Otherwise, people would not start doing things like that, right? And then finally, as we all very well know, the Europeans actually denied the opportunity to offset emissions by like cheap reductions from anywhere else. And especially, I'm not quite sure that to that end, we should also like rely on the opportunity to Article 6 Paris Agreement. Well, it would be kind of a niche business. And I would say that probably for some Russian, for instance, forest companies, that would be nice to explore the opportunity. But in general, there's not going to happen. Okay, I understand that, well, from the economic point of view, you should first exploit the cheapest technology. And to that end, probably investing in Russian business would be more like reasonable than to invest in the European business. But it doesn't work like that under Paris Agreement, so far at least, right? So each country put their efforts within the borders of this country with a little bit in terms of, supporting the developing countries by transferring money from north to south, but it's a completely different story. So I would actually think that to that end, we should be prepared for higher carbon prices, and we should be prepared also for higher commodity prices in the market for a while. And then that will actually make a new incentive for developing completely new technologies that are really, really low carbon, like green oxygen green hydrogen technologies in the steel making. This is a completely new world, and we should be prepared. We shouldn't think about this new era, new stage in terms of existing technologies. We should be more focusing on breakthrough, disruptive technologies that are going to happen and are going to take the stage sooner rather than later. Thank you.
Thank you, Mikhail. Igor Bashmakov, your last comment.
Yeah, brief comments on this price cap. First, there is switch price, which Mikhail just have discussed. So new technologies will be capable to mitigate in case prices are too high. One comment, and the second comment is what we really lack. We really lack knowledge of the carbon price cap, which can keep economy developing. In many models, they have no feedback between carbon prices and economic growth. They assume economic growth and impose whatever carbon price, up to $600 per ton of carbon by 2050. But economy cannot develop with this high carbon price. But we don't know quite well yet the limits of price evolution in time, which allows economy to develop. And that specific subject for research and better understanding. We already know that oil price cannot stay for a long time above $100 per barrel. So we could have something like that for carbon price, but we have to understand. And clearly, carbon price above $100 per ton of CO2 will not allow economy, whatever country it is, to develop. So it will just bring country to economic recession.
Thank you, Igor. Okay, we still have a few minutes. I want to give a couple of minutes to each of our presenters to make the overview of what we have discussed and what we didn't discuss. Please, Andrei, the floor is yours.
Yeah, I think I actually made my, I preempted my this final conversation, because I think what Igor Bashmanov said is totally correct. I mean, we are not looking anymore at we have been, since Rio 92, we have been tinkering at the edges and changing technology and changing things at a very slow pace. We are now in a world where things have changed radically, and thinking that you can in some way survive on these technologies is going to be a very difficult thing. The name that we have, a sustainable transition, is really about this period of transition. And that period of transition, I sincerely believe, for the power industry, we kind of know how we do it. The question is, who pays the bill? In Germany, it's been the consumer that's been paying the bill, and the long-paying German consumer has been paying through his nose. And I think that at some point it is, hopefully we're reaching a plateau. But the question is, who pays for energy for the transition of industry? And it is going to have to be also in some way being done through contract for difference, somebody covering the cost of somebody calculated that in the end, in the European Union, the cost of the transition is about €1,000 per person. If you are to take that, and is everybody and every citizen on Europe willing to pay €1,000, then you can do it. Not everybody can pay €1,000, and some may pay more, some may pay less. But in the end, there is going to have to be some kind of adjustment, I believe, in the way, if you think this is real, then moving on the same model of development is just not going to work. It's just not going to work. It's not, I desire it or not desire it. It's a question, it's a mathematical economic situation.
Okay, thank you, Andrei. Igor, Makarov, please, your comments.
Thank you. Actually, I should say that there are a lot of opportunities for Russia and the EU to cooperate in this area. And for me, it's a pity that now it is not about cooperation, but it is about confrontation, and it goes in confrontational way. Russia looks at this as protectionism at best, or as a political weapon as worst. The European Union also looks at Russia as a spoiler in the global climate change regime, and so the space for cooperation is narrowing, unfortunately. But I think that Europe can't be absolutely carbon neutral without Russia, just because Russia delivers a lot of intermediate and primary goods to Europe. And yes, of course, Europe may reduce emissions significantly on its own territory, but Europe can't be carbon neutral from the perspective of consumption, because it depends on the deliveries from other countries. And I think that CBAM is one of the opportunities to address this problem, but it should not be the only opportunity, and it should not be the most important opportunity. And I think that the joint projects on the Russian territory between the EU and Russia are necessary. And I think that we may remember that in 1970, when the political relations between the Soviet Union and the European Union were not better, or were even worse than now, the political political relations between Russia and the EU. But the deal of the century was concluded in 1970, which linked Russia, the Soviet Union, with Europe, with the network of pipelines, which determined the relationship between two regions for decades, for more than 50 years already. And I think that the new deal of the century is necessary, actually, and which substitutes the oil and gas interdependence with some other types of interdependencies, and green development, whatever it is, green hydrogen deliveries from Russia to the EU, or the flows of green finance from the European Union to the Russian low carbon projects, or some other areas of cooperation. I think that we should move to that new deal of the century, because that was concluded 50 years ago. It is irrelevant to the new world already. But Russia and Europe, they need each other anyway. And I think that this need is in two ways. Russia needs Europe, but Europe also needs Russia. Europe can't decarbonize again without Russia. So I think that the coming decade will bring us this new Russian-European deal. But for now, we are very far from it, unfortunately.
Thank you, Igor. Okay, we still have 1 minute, and I want to let me come to what I started with. So the world is changing, and decarbonization processes are moving on and on. So we see some evidence, many different evidences of what is going to change the whole global economy and national economies. So I think we have touched lots of questions in our today's event, but we definitely have not finished the discussion. So my proposal is that we should continue, and I would like to ask Igor Makarov and Andrei to continue organizing similar events to discuss what this new 2021 year will bring us on this agenda. I guess we have a lot to talk about and share our experiences and our ideas. So I want to thank Andrei for presentation and Igor for presentation, and all our participants for being with us this evening. Thank you very much, and look forward to meeting you again. Thank you.
Thank you for the invitation, Georgi. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, guys. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Really, really useful.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye.